Administration will update the board on fiscal year 2018 budget development. This item provides an opportunity for the board's information and discussion.
We always save the best for last,
Yes, everybody's
right?
favorite part of the evening. Well, good evening, President Logan, Superintendent Allison, members of the board, Dr. Thompson. Tonight, I'd like to provide a brief update on the budget development process as we are now in the last quarter of fiscal year 17, and we continue to do the best that we can to plan for fiscal year 18. I say brief because we are still waiting on several key decisions at the legislative level before we really can dive too deep into fiscal year 18 planning. One little piece of good news coming out of Topeka is that the legislature did finalize fiscal year 17's budget. So that process did not provide for any cuts to education. So it looks like for fiscal year 17, we're off the hook for any mid-year cuts. And that is good news. It does allow us to finish the year without having to worry about that piece. And so we can focus on fiscal year 18. That said, we are still waiting at this point on a funding formula to come out of the legislature. We need a tax package to go with that funding formula. If we're to get any additional funds, we'll need the tax package to fill the budget hole the state has, plus address the additional fund issue. So those two pieces make it very difficult to move forward to address any sort of cut plan for fiscal year 18 until we know what that final budget picture is going to look like. If we look at the legislative timeline, we go back to March where the Supreme Court held that K-12 financing, the block grant system, did not meet the adequacy requirements of the state constitution. From that point until April 7th, we've had nothing come to vote at the House or the Senate as far as the formula. Now, there is a bill in committee in the House, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a slide here in just a minute or so. But it is really still at the committee level, and it's still being amended. There's still work being done. And the tax issue, we've seen some flat tax proposals out of the Senate. Those have been voted down, so we don't really have a tax package that's really viable at this point. And of course, at this point, the legislature has gone into break. We won't see anything happen until May 1st, where the veto session begins. And at that point, as indicated, we'll see a lot of work, hopefully in those first few weeks, but in reality, by the time it goes through both the House and the Senate, and then goes to the governor for approval, potentially comes back from the governor for a possible veto override, any funding formula piece still has to go through the Supreme Court for review to see if they feel that meets the adequacy requirements. So, and all of this is transpiring as we approach a June 30, 2017 deadline that the Supreme Court imposed for the legislature to have an adequate financing system in place. And what happens at June 30th, if you recall, very similar to last year, is that the threat of school closure is back on the table. And so the district is facing that very same threat of potential school closure if the adequacy piece of the formula is deemed to be insufficient. And the situation for this fiscal year is probably more serious than last fiscal year.
If you think about last year with the threat of school shutdown, it was over between $30 and $40 million and required reprioritizing of the budget and did not require any type of tax increase. The adequacy component is much larger than that in its implication. The state's in a deeper financial hole and will require something to be done from a taxation standpoint. So the complexity and just the size of the issue is a much greater magnitude than we faced last year in those discussions.
So at this point, we are hoping for the best, but we are planning for the worst-case scenario. Kind of on the hope side of the ledger, if you will, if we look at House Bill 2410, which is commonly known as the Campbell Bill, as that bill currently reads, although there is no printed copy of this bill since it's still in committee, it could provide enough funding to cover some, if not all, of our current year cost increase estimates for fiscal year 18. It could. We've seen numbers as low as 3 to 5 million. We've seen numbers recently as high as 12 to 14 million. But that bill is still very much in the conversation process. Various amendments were proposed before the break. We would anticipate amendments coming out in the veto session. So that bill is still very much in process. In fact, the legislative leadership hired an attorney last Friday to review the work that had been done so far. That process will be ongoing. And again, that K-12 committee will meet on May 1st, and those discussions will start again in earnest. So, but again, that bill would still have to go through all of those processes to pass the House, the Senate, the governor's approval, and then Supreme Court review.
We do have a question, Joy? And this is probably for Superintendent Allison. It's just around the legislative timeline. If the legislature gives the Supreme Court a finance plan by 6/30/17 to begin to review, do you think the Supreme Court would allow schools to continue to operate while it reviewed the plan? Any idea?
I would assume so, because they have in the past. If there's what seems to be a legitimate attempt and solution, the courts have been willing to grant some latitude to be able to review that. And if you look back with Montoy, not only did they do that, they gave them some extended time because they felt they were making some progress. So, yep, that's very possible, at least on past court action, but you never know.
But the downside of that is then that means that the legislative session could then drag out, and we could be finding out when we have things in August or mid-July or.
Yes, that's very possible. And this is just my opinion. So,
Sure.
I believe if the school finance formula looks for, in most ways, similar to the previous formula, there's that the court has already reviewed that and found it constitutional. If a formula goes in front of the court that is markedly different, it's going to be much more difficult for the court to assess what those implications look like, and that could take longer and delay things, if that makes any sense. So I think part of this will be in what does the formula look like that is passed and funded will have a definite effect on the timeliness of the court's review.
Okay, then if there's a formula, that's what goes before the Supreme Court, but is the funding of that formula part of that review, or is that a separate issue as far as the court is concerned?
It will be part of the review because what the court found was inadequate funding. And then they also found that the block grant was unconstitutional. So it's going to be a combo. They have to have a constitutional formula, and they're going to have to show that the funding of whatever that constitutional formula looks like will move toward the adequacy piece. So they could come up with a formula that's very much resembles the previous formula, and if they're only putting $1 million new into it, they may be okay with the formula, but they won't be with the funding mechanism and say that it hasn't met adequacy at that point.
Okay, so they have maintained jurisdiction over both of those. Okay,
They have.
Thank you.
And this particular bill it's a 5-year program. At the total package, I believe, is $750 million in its current version, but it is a 5-year phase-in, and that is another piece the court could look at it to see if that is a sufficient or acceptable timeline, or does money need to move in a little faster?
Two things to think about. You think about 150 million, sounds like a great deal of money. You think about 750 over 5 years. I think a concern for school districts is that 5-year phase-in, because the track record has not been real positive when it's been stretched out. Under Montoy, we made it about 2 years. So in that 5 years, you'll have had new House, you'll be looking at new Senate, and you may be on second or third governor. So, that's a lot of unknowns. And what we haven't seen as a track record is legislators honoring the commitment of previous legislators when it comes to school finance. So that's of concern that it stretches out that long. The other piece is if you think about 750 million, that gets schools back to where we were in about 2009 before the cuts in that 09-10 school year. So even with that sizable investment, which really shows you what the size of the cuts were, that's only getting us back to where we were 10 years ago. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And I know it's difficult to talk about 750 million, kind of that, I hear that retort, when is enough enough? Well, if you think about, that gets us back to where we were a decade ago, and all the cost increases that have occurred over that time period, it's better than where we are now, but it still hasn't given us much of a leg up on where we need to be moving forward.
So if at least that there is some movement, at least at the House level with this K-12 bill, that's on the positive side. On the not so positive side, again, a reminder that the budget shortfall for the state just to break even on its own budget for next year is almost $600 million. So that additional money that they would need on the funding formula, they're going to have to raise taxes enough to cover both those pieces. So, and again, we haven't seen a whole lot of positive action on the tax front at this point. So there's just still a lot of work left to do in a shrinking period of time. So just a reminder that our estimates haven't really changed a whole lot since the last presentation. We're still looking at an $8.2 million figure that we need to cover just to open the doors. And that doesn't cover any fiscal year 18 wage increases, remembering that we needed to cover the step and track given in fiscal year 17, and doesn't include a potential calendar change. So at this point, our next steps are, again, to make sure that we have those cost estimates refined so that we know exactly where we're as close as we can possibly be going into this last quarter. We keep a close eye on the legislative action, and we start to really dig into the shutdown plans that we put in, that we had ready to go for last year. We'll be bringing those back for some discussion as the timeline gets closer and closer to that date. So kind of the key takeaways tonight are the good news that fiscal year 17 looks to not have a potential mid-year cut, but that fiscal year 18 decisions are very difficult until we get that legislative action, and that the timeline to develop workable solutions is getting tighter and tighter, both needing to pass through the governor and the court's review, and that the shutdown is a possibility if we don't meet the 6/30 deadline. Questions?
Well, I am seeing no questions for you. It's because we don't like your message, but Thank you very much.